Dr. Edmund Frost made his first cut into the infected wound in February 1856. He worked by candlelight in a cabin so far away that even the closest neighbor lived 8 miles from there. The child's fever had almost killed her before he got there. What bothered him more than the ignored infection was the way the 3 children watched him. Silent and still, as if they were scared to breathe without permission. The Weaver homestead sat in a valley so deep that winter fog never completely cleared. Frost had ridden for 6 hours through frozen woods after getting word from a trapper that a family needed medical help. The cabin itself was solid enough, built from hand-cut logs, but the windows had been covered with boards from the inside. When Weaver finally let him in, he noticed the ways the building had been changed to keep people inside rather than keep dangers out. There were 3 children. Caleb, the oldest at 18, stood nearly 6 feet tall but moved with the awkward steps of someone not used to his own body. His skin looked pale from not enough sunlight. June, 16, had taken care of her younger sister's wound well, but her hands shook when Weaver came into the room. Lily, the patient, was 14 and dangerously thin. All 3 wore clothes that had been fixed so many times you could barely tell what the original cloth looked like. Weaver herself looked about 50 years old, though hard times made it difficult to tell her exact age. She spoke in the sharp way of someone who expected complete obedience and had never been disappointed. When Frost suggested the children needed better food and more physical activity, she told him that she alone decided what her children needed. The conversation ended there. As Frost cleaned and bandaged Lily's wound, he looked around the cabin's inside. No books, no newspapers, no sign of any connection to the outside world beyond the most basic necessities. The children's sleeping area was separated from the main room by a hanging blanket, and through the gap, he saw mattresses on the floor instead of proper beds. Most disturbing was the heavy door built into the cabin's floor. Its iron hinges and heavy lock suggested something between a root cellar and a jail cell. Before leaving, Frost wrote down his observations in the leather journal he carried for medical notes. He recorded the children's physical condition, the unusual security features, and his growing belief that something in this isolated valley went against both medicine and morality. He noted Weaver's refusal to explain her husband's absence or give almost any family history. Most importantly, he wrote down his plan to return within the month to check on Lily's recovery. That journal, found in a Boston archive in 1923, would provide the first believable account of what happened at the Weaver homestead. But on that February afternoon, Frost simply rode away through the fog, troubled by feelings he couldn't yet explain, unaware that he would become the only outside witness to a horror that had continued for generations. The property records for the Weaver homestead told a story that took decades to fully understand. When county record keepers finally looked at the documents in 1889, after a courthouse fire destroyed much of the original record book, they discovered an inheritance pattern that didn't follow normal family structures. The land had been claimed in 1832 by a woman named Constance Weaver. No husband's name appeared on the deed. The next transfer happened in 1847, passing to her daughter Rebecca Weaver, again with no male co-owner listed, then to Ma Weaver, whose given name was recorded as Prudence in 1851. Each transfer happened without a sale or standard inheritance process, simply a quiet move from mother to oldest child. What made the records truly disturbing was the census data. In 1840, Constance Weaver had reported 5 children living in the household. By 1850, only Rebecca remained, now with 4 children of her own. Of Constance's other 4 children, there were no marriage records, no property transfers, no death certificates. They had simply disappeared from all official records as if they had never existed beyond that single census entry. Frost discovered this pattern by accident when he mentioned the Weaver family to traveling preacher Hosea Barnett in March 1856. Barnett's face went pale at the name. He explained that he had visited the homestead 2 years earlier in 1854, trying to bring the family into his church. Ma Weaver had met him at the property line with a rifle and told him that the Weavers needed no spiritual guidance from outsiders. But Barnett had glimpsed something during that brief encounter. Through the cabin's open door, he saw the heavy cellar entrance and heard what sounded like a child crying from below. When he asked about the sound, Ma Weaver told him it was just the wind through the floorboards. The preacher didn't believe her, but the rifle in her hands and how far away the place was discouraged further investigation. He admitted to Frost that he had failed in his duty, that he should have alerted authorities. But in the Ozarks of the 1850s, a mother's control over her household was considered absolute and sacred. Frost began asking careful questions in the scattered communities around the Weaver property. Most people knew nothing about the family. Those who did spoke of them in hushed tones, sharing bits of disturbing stories. A blacksmith in the nearest town, 12 miles from the valley, remembered making unusual iron fixtures for Rebecca Weaver in 1848. Restraints, he called them, though he thought they were meant for farm animals. The measurements had been exact, designed for a tight space with dimensions matching a root cellar's size. A midwife, elderly and hesitant to speak, remembered being called to the Weaver property twice in the 1840s. Both times for difficult births. Both times she had been paid well and made to promise silence. When Frost pressed her for details, she would only say that she had delivered healthy babies, but that something about the mother's behavior had terrified her. The woman had shown no joy, no relief, only a cold satisfaction that the children had survived. The cellar itself became Frost's obsession. Standard root cellars in the area were simple dirt spaces for food storage, perhaps 8 feet square and tall enough for a person to stand. But the door he'd seen in the Weaver cabin was reinforced beyond any practical need. The iron hinges were the kind used for jail cells in the county courthouse. The lock was internal, meaning someone inside the cabin could lock the cellar, but those below could not escape. Frost wrote in his journal that the Weaver property felt less like a homestead and more like a machine designed for a specific terrible purpose. He simply couldn't yet imagine what that purpose might be. Sarah Hutchkins lived 8 miles northeast of the Weaver Hollow, close enough to occasionally trade goods but far enough to maintain a comfortable distance. Her diary, preserved by descendants and donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1931, provides the only contemporary civilian account of the Weaver family's final months. In March 1856, she recorded Ma Weaver's first unusual visit. The woman arrived on foot despite the distance, carrying a list of specific items: rope, thick and strong candles, far more than any household would need for ordinary use, dried herbs that Sarah recognized from her grandmother's folk remedies, plants connected with old superstitions about fertility and bloodline purity. Ma Weaver paid in silver coins, unusual for the trade economy of the region, and insisted on counting out exact amounts. During that visit, Ma Weaver mentioned that Caleb would soon turn 18. She spoke of the date with the seriousness others might use when discussing a wedding or funeral. Sarah wrote that the woman's eyes held a strange gleam when she said her son had been kept pure for his purpose, a phrase that made no sense in frontier life, where young men were expected to work, hunt, and court by that age. April brought 3 more visits, each requesting stranger items: a particular type of root used by Cherokee healers, one Sarah had to get through her own connections, iron hooks small enough to fit in a closed hand, strips of leather, soft and bendable. When Sarah asked what these supplies were for, Ma Weaver replied only that tradition demanded preparation, and that the Weaver line had survived through careful following of old ways. The most disturbing visit happened in early May. Ma Weaver arrived after dark carrying a lantern and asked if Sarah had ever heard of families keeping their children separate from outside corruption. Sarah, thinking she meant religious isolation, mentioned several communities that limited their young people's exposure to worldly influences. Ma Weaver shook her head impatiently. She meant something deeper, she said. Something about making sure the family remained undiluted, that weakness couldn't enter the bloodline through foreign marriages. Sarah noted in her diary that she had felt deep unease during this conversation. Ma Weaver spoke of her daughters with a detachment that seemed unnatural, referring to them as vessels and tools rather than children. She mentioned that June and Lily had been prepared since birth for their roles in maintaining the family's strength, though she never said what those roles involved. When Sarah suggested that perhaps the girls should meet young men from neighboring communities, Ma Weaver's expression turned cold. Outside blood would poison everything, she said. The Weaver line preserved itself. By late May, Sarah recorded that she had stopped accepting Ma Weaver's visits. The woman's requests had become too specific, too purposeful, and the collection of supplies suggested preparation for something Sarah didn't want to imagine. She wrote that she considered alerting authorities but dismissed the idea, knowing that mothers in isolated homesteads often held unusual beliefs and that frontier law rarely stepped into family matters unless violence was reported. The final entry about the Weavers, dated June 2, 1856, described seeing June Weaver in the woods near the property line. The girl had been gathering wild herbs but froze when she saw Sarah like a deer startled by hunters. Sarah approached carefully, asking if everything was well at home. June's response was barely audible. She said that Caleb's birthday was in 1 week and that mother had said everything would change afterward. When Sarah asked what she meant, June simply turned and ran back toward the valley. Sarah never saw any of the Weaver children again until the events that would bring Dr. Frost back to the homestead and finally exposed what had been hidden in that isolated cabin for generations. June discovered the loose floorboard by accident on the morning of June 5, 1856. She had been scrubbing the main room's floor, a task Ma Weaver gave her daily, when her brush caught on a section of wood that shifted slightly under pressure. The board was near the stone fireplace, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and had been cut to fit so exactly that its edges were nearly invisible. She waited until Ma Weaver left to check the animal traps before investigating further. Caleb was splitting wood outside and Lily was sewing in the corner, but her younger sister had learned long ago not to speak unless spoken to. June worked her fingers under the board's edge and lifted. The space beneath was perhaps 18 inches deep, carved into the packed dirt between floor joists. Inside was a collection that made June's breath catch in her throat: small dresses, carefully folded and preserved with dried lavender. She counted 14 pieces of clothing ranging from sizes that would fit a baby to clothing meant for a child of perhaps 10 years. The fabric varied in age and condition. Some were so old the material crumbled at her touch. Others seemed newer, made from cloth June recognized from her own childhood. Several of the dresses had dark stains that had turned to brown. June had helped prepare hunted animals often enough to recognize the color of old blood. Beneath the clothing, she found letters, 3 of them, written on paper yellowed with age. The handwriting was different in each, suggesting different authors, but all were addressed to Mother, and the content made June's hands shake as she read. The first letter, dated 1843, was written in a child's shaky handwriting. It begged forgiveness for unnamed failures and pleaded for release from the cellar. The second, from 1848, was more clear but desperate, asking why the writer's sisters had disappeared and whether she would disappear too. The third letter had no date but spoke of pregnancy and fear, of not wanting to have a child under these circumstances, of hoping someone would find the letter after everything was finished. June heard footsteps outside and quickly replaced everything, pressing the board back into position. Her mind raced through calculations she had been avoiding for months. Maweaver had spoken often of the Weaver tradition, of how the family had maintained its strength through generations by refusing outside interference. She had mentioned ancestors who had fulfilled their duties and those who had failed. June had assumed these were abstract lessons about obedience and family loyalty. The dresses suggested something far more concrete and horrifying. That evening, June waited until Maweaver was busy preparing supper before whispering to Caleb near the woodpile. She described what she had found, keeping her voice low and her body positioned to block anyone's view of their conversation. Caleb's face lost all color as she spoke. He admitted that Maweaver had been talking to him privately for weeks, explaining his responsibilities as the oldest son, describing rituals that must be performed to prove his worthiness to lead the family. He had thought she meant hunting or building skills. Now, with June's discovery, he understood she meant something else entirely. Lily joined them after dark, moving silently as she had learned to do. June showed her younger sister the hiding place, and together they examined the evidence by candlelight while Maweaver slept. Lily pointed out that one of the smaller dresses had been hers, a piece of clothing she remembered wearing at age 7, but that had disappeared from her possession years ago. She asked why Mother would hide children's clothing like treasured relics unless those children no longer existed to wear them. The three siblings sat in the darkness of the main room, listening to their mother's breathing from behind the partition, and realized that Caleb's 18th birthday, now just 4 days away, marked a deadline they didn't yet fully understand but knew they had to prevent. On the evening of June 8, 1856, Maweaver unlocked the cellar door for the first time in Caleb's memory. She ordered her daughters to go down the wooden stairs and prepare the space according to her exact instructions. Caleb stood frozen near the fireplace as his mother explained that the next day would determine whether he was worthy of the Weaver name or whether he would fail as others before him had failed. The cellar was larger than Caleb had imagined, perhaps 12 feet square with a ceiling high enough for him to stand upright. The dirt walls had been reinforced with timber, and the floor was packed dirt that looked almost polished from years of use. June and Lily worked in silence, following their mother's instructions to arrange candles in an exact circle, 43 in total. The number had significance that Maweaver didn't explain, though she checked the placement obsessively, adjusting positions by inches. The iron fixtures Caleb had glimpsed during Dr. Frost's visit were revealed in full chains mounted to the walls at intervals, their purpose unmistakable, hooks driven into the support beams overhead, a table built from rough boards, its surface stained dark in the center. Maweaver ran her hand along these tools with something close to tenderness, explaining that they had served the family for 3 generations and would continue to serve for generations more. She began speaking then of tradition in terms that made Caleb's stomach turn. The Weaver bloodline, she explained, remained pure because the family recognized that strength came from within, not from outside corruption. Other families allowed their children to marry strangers, weakening their essence with foreign blood. The Weavers understood that true power required sacrifice, and that women existed to maintain the line through their service to male heirs. June stood against the far wall, her face showing no emotion, but Caleb saw her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Lily had begun to shake, a tremor that started in her shoulders and spread through her entire body. Maweaver noticed neither reaction, or didn't care. She described the ritual in clinical terms, explaining that Caleb's 18th birthday marked his rise to patriarch. The test of his worthiness involved proving his dominance over the female members of his bloodline, demonstrating that he could control and claim them as previous Weaver men had done. Only through this act could he ensure that future children would be born untainted by outside influence, that the family would continue its tradition of isolation and self-sufficiency. When Caleb asked what happened to children born from such unions, Maweaver's expression hardened. She explained that some had been strong and had contributed to the family's continuation. Others had shown weakness or deformity and had been dealt with accordingly. The Weaver line tolerated no imperfection. Caleb finally understood the dresses hidden beneath the floorboards and the letters June had found. He understood why census records showed children who later vanished and why the property had passed only through specific family lines. The tradition Maweaver described wasn't ancient or honorable. It was a pattern of abuse that had somehow survived through isolation and secrecy, hidden so deep in the Ozark wilderness that no authority had ever investigated long enough to uncover it. His mother continued speaking, explaining that June and Lily understood their roles and had been prepared since childhood to fulfill them. She mentioned previous generations where daughters had served this purpose and that the practice ensured absolute family loyalty. No daughter could betray the Weavers when she was bound by such intimate involvement. As Maweaver spoke, describing acts she expected him to perform with matter-of-fact cruelty, Caleb felt something shift inside him. He had been raised to obey without question, isolated from any competing moral framework, but the horror of what she demanded penetrated even his limited understanding of right and wrong. He looked at his sisters, saw their terror and resignation, and knew that tomorrow would determine not his worthiness, but whether the Weaver tradition would finally end or consume another generation. Night fell on June 9, 1856, and Ma Weaver lit the candles in the cellar one by one. The children went down the stairs in order of age, Caleb first, then June, finally Lily. Ma Weaver locked the door behind them and placed the iron key in her apron pocket. She had dressed for the occasion in what appeared to be ceremonial clothing, a black dress that Caleb had never seen her wear, suggesting this ritual had been planned for years. She positioned June and Lily against the far wall, instructing them to remain silent and obedient. Then she turned to Caleb and explained in explicit terms what he was expected to do. The traditions she described were presented as ancestral wisdom, as practices that had sustained the Weaver family since its founding. She referenced his grandfather, his great-grandfather, claiming they had all undergone this same trial and proven their strength. Caleb stood in the center of the candlelit space and said a single word, "No." The silence that followed was absolute. Ma Weaver's face showed confusion, as if Caleb had spoken in a foreign language. She asked him to repeat himself, certain she had misheard. When he refused again, stating clearly that he would not harm his sisters regardless of tradition or consequence, her expression changed into something far more dangerous than anger. She screamed that he was weak, that he had failed before the test even began, that generations of Weaver strength would end because of his cowardice. She grabbed one of the chains from the wall and moved toward June, declaring that if Caleb wouldn't act, she would demonstrate what happened to daughters in families where the patriarch proved inadequate. The chain rattled in her hands as she moved, and June pressed herself against the timber wall with nowhere to retreat. In her rage, Ma Weaver revealed what had been carefully hidden. She spoke of the previous generation, of Caleb's own origins, admitting that his father had been her brother, that Caleb himself was the product of the very tradition she demanded he continue. She referenced the children who had resulted from such unions across the decades, describing in clinical terms which ones had survived to continue the pattern, and which had been too damaged to serve any purpose. She mentioned specific dates and locations within the property, the corner of the cellar where weak infants had been buried, the forest section where slightly older children had been abandoned when their deformities became apparent, the well that had been sealed in 1848 after serving as a repository for those who couldn't be buried near the cabin. Each revelation was delivered with the detached tone of someone discussing crop rotation or livestock management. Lily began to weep silently, her body sliding down the wall until she sat in the dirt. June remained frozen, watching their mother with an expression somewhere between terror and calculation. Caleb felt the full weight of understanding settle on him. Every ancestor Ma Weaver had praised, every tradition she had treated as sacred, was built on the systematic abuse of children who had no escape and no voice. Ma Weaver turned back to Caleb, the chain still gripped in her hand, and gave him one final chance to prove himself. She pointed to June and repeated her command, her voice dropping to the same tone she had used throughout their childhood when obedience was not negotiable. The candles cast shadows that made the cellar seem alive, and the iron fixtures gleamed in the flickering light like instruments awaiting their purpose. Caleb looked at his mother, this woman who had shaped his entire existence around a horrifying legacy, and recognized that whatever happened next would determine not just his future, but whether the pattern of abuse that had destroyed countless lives would finally be broken or would claim another generation of victims. Ma Weaver raised the chain above her head, preparing to strike June for Caleb's defiance. In that moment of distraction, with her attention focused on punishing her daughter, June saw an opportunity that would never come again. One of the iron hooks hung within reach on the wall behind her, smaller than the chains but heavy enough to serve as a weapon. She seized it and swung with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed. The metal connected with Ma Weaver's shoulder, and the older woman stumbled sideways, dropping the chain. The sound that came from her throat was equal parts pain and fury, a howl of rage that someone under her absolute control had dared to resist. Caleb moved then, tackling his mother before she could recover. They crashed into the dirt floor together, scattering candles and plunging sections of the cellar into shadow. Ma Weaver fought with the strength of someone who had spent decades wielding unchallenged authority, clawing at Caleb's face and screaming that he would be punished for his betrayal, that all three children would suffer for this rebellion. June grabbed the chain her mother had dropped and wrapped it around Ma Weaver's wrists as Caleb pinned her arms. Lily, shaking violently, got another length of chain from the wall. Together, the three siblings secured their mother using the very restraints she had prepared for them, locking her wrists and ankles to the iron fixtures mounted in the cellar's center post. Ma Weaver's threats filled the space, echoing off the dirt walls. She promised they would starve without her guidance, that they were too weak to survive alone, that the authorities would never believe children who attacked their mother. She called on the Weaver ancestors, claiming their spirits would punish this destruction of tradition. As her fury exhausted itself into bitter cursing, Lily spoke for the first time that night. Her voice was barely audible, but what she said made both her siblings freeze. She described finding something months earlier while getting stored vegetables from the cellar, something she had been too terrified to mention. In the corner where Ma Weaver had referenced burying weak infants, Lily had discovered bones while digging to expand the storage space. Small bones, the skeleton of a child perhaps 6 months old, its skull showing an abnormality that explained why it hadn't been allowed to live. She had reburied the remains and said nothing, knowing that to speak of it would invite her mother's wrath. But now, with Maweaver chained and helpless, Lily could finally give voice to the horror she had carried alone. The revelation broke something in Caleb. He demanded his mother explain how many children had died in this cellar, how many generations the practice had continued. Maweaver, perhaps recognizing that her control was truly shattered, answered with cold precision. She cited numbers going back to 1832, when her grandmother had first established the homestead specifically for this purpose, choosing the location for its isolation and establishing the pattern that each generation had maintained. She explained the selection process, how children who showed promise were raised to continue the tradition while those who showed weakness or deformity were eliminated. She referenced specific locations throughout the property where remains had been disposed of, speaking of murder with the same casual tone others might use to discuss pruning dead branches. June asked the question that had haunted her since finding the letters. What happened to the daughters who resisted? Maweaver's smile was terrible to witness. They learned obedience eventually, she said, or they joined the children in the unmarked graves. The 3 siblings stood in the candlelight, their mother secured to the post, and faced an impossible reality. They were miles from any authority, in the dead of night, with no proof that would be believed in an era when parental discipline was considered sacred. Maweaver, despite her restraints, still believed she would ultimately win, that the isolation that had protected the Weaver tradition for decades would protect it still. Her laughter filled the cellar as she told them they had only delayed the inevitable. Edmund Frost had spent the past 3 months troubled by his February visit to the Weaver homestead. Something about the children's condition and Maweaver's rigid control had stuck in his mind like a splinter, bothering him despite his attempts to focus on other patients. When a break in the summer weather provided safe passage through the wilderness, he made the decision to return unannounced on June 12, 1856. He arrived in the early afternoon to find the cabin eerily silent. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool mountain air. No sounds of daily activity came from inside. When his knocking produced no response, Frost tested the door and found it barred from within. He called out, identifying himself, and heard movement followed by whispered voices. After several minutes, the door opened a crack. Caleb stood in the gap, his appearance shocking even to a physician used to frontier hardship. The young man looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his eyes sunken and his hands shaking. Behind him, Frost glimpsed June and Lily huddled near the fireplace, both wrapped in blankets despite the season. Caleb asked why Frost had come. The doctor explained his concern about Lily's recovery and his general uneasiness about the family's welfare. At this, something in Caleb's expression crumbled. He asked if Frost could be trusted, if a physician's oath meant he would help people even when the truth was difficult to hear. Frost assured him that his duty was to his patients' well-being above all else. The story that emerged over the next hour went against everything Frost thought he understood about human nature. Caleb spoke in halting sentences, frequently stopping to collect himself, describing the events of 3 nights before. June added details when her brother's voice failed him, and even Lily contributed pieces of testimony, though speaking clearly caused her visible distress. They showed Frost the cellar, the candles still arranged in their circle, the chains now securing Maweaver to the center post. The woman had stopped speaking entirely, staring at the wall with an expression of such hatred that Frost instinctively stepped back. They showed him the loose floorboard and its contents, the small dresses and desperate letters. Lily led him to the corner where she had found infant bones, and Caleb pointed to locations throughout the property that Maweaver had identified as burial sites. Frost's medical training provided no framework for processing such systematic cruelty. He examined Maweaver briefly, confirming she was physically unharmed though severely dehydrated from 3 days without water. When he attempted to question her, she fixed him with a stare of absolute contempt and remained silent. The only words she spoke were to her children, promising that justice would find them eventually, that blood called to blood, and traditions could not be broken by a single generation's weakness. Frost made his assessment quickly. The children needed immediate protection, and authorities had to be notified despite the complications such notification would bring. He explained to Caleb that he would ride to the county seat and return with the sheriff, that the evidence they had preserved was crucial, and that they should touch nothing in the cellar until officials could examine it. Before leaving, he asked the question that had been troubling him since entering the cabin: why hadn't they simply fled? 3 young people could have disappeared into the wilderness and never been found. Caleb's answer was simple and devastating. They had nowhere to go, no understanding of the world beyond the valley, and no certainty that anyone would believe their story over their mother's testimony. They had restrained her not as punishment, but as the only way to survive until someone with authority arrived to witness the truth. Frost rode toward the county seat as quickly as the terrain allowed, pushing his horse harder than was wise. He carried in his saddlebag a single piece of evidence. One of the letters found beneath the floorboard, dated 1848 and signed by a girl named Rebecca, who begged forgiveness for wanting to die rather than continue serving the family's tradition. Sheriff William Garrett arrived at the Weaver homestead on June 14th with Dr. Frost and two deputies. A lawman for 15 years, Garrett had investigated murders, land disputes, and frontier violence of every variety. Nothing in his experience prepared him for what the children described or what the physical evidence suggested. Weaver had regained her voice by the time authorities entered the cellar. She immediately claimed her children had suffered a collective madness, that they had attacked her without provocation and imprisoned her in her own home. She demanded the sheriff arrest all three for assault and false imprisonment, insisting that any claims they made about family traditions were fantasies designed to justify their violence. Her testimony was measured and clear. She explained that frontier isolation sometimes caused young people to develop strange delusions, particularly when they reached adulthood without proper socialization. She suggested that Caleb, facing the responsibilities of manhood, had experienced a breakdown and convinced his sisters to participate in his paranoid fantasies. The chains, she claimed, were old tools left by previous property owners. The candles were simply her attempt to provide light during her imprisonment. Garrett listened without interruption, then asked her to explain the letters hidden beneath the floorboard. Weaver's expression flickered momentarily before she composed herself. Old correspondence, she said, probably left by previous occupants of the homestead. When Garrett pointed out that the letters referenced mother and described events matching the children's testimony, she insisted on her right to remain silent until proper legal representation could be arranged. The sheriff turned his attention to the cellar itself. The iron fixtures mounted to walls and beams were clearly not remnants from previous owners, but had been installed with deliberate purpose. The stains on the wooden table, when examined closely, showed patterns consistent with repeated use. Most stunning was what Deputy Harrison discovered when he began carefully digging in the corner Lily had identified. The infant skeleton was exactly where she had described it, buried approximately 18 inches below the floor's surface. The skull showed a deformity visible even to non-medical observers, and the careful arrangement of the remains suggested intentional burial rather than accidental death. Dr. Frost, examining the bones by lantern light, estimated the child had been perhaps 6 to 8 months old at time of death. Over the following week, deputies expanded their investigation across the property. They found 3 more burial sites matching locations Weaver had referenced during her revelations in the cellar. 2 contained skeletal remains of children between infancy and early adolescence. The third site near the sealed well Weaver had mentioned proved too disturbed by time and weather to yield conclusive evidence, though bone fragments were recovered. The children's testimony remained consistent across multiple interviews. June provided details about the dresses and their probable owners. Caleb described his mother's explicit instructions about the ritual she had planned. Lily, though traumatized nearly beyond speech, confirmed specific statements Weaver had made about the family's history and practices. Garrett faced a profound challenge. Missouri law in 1856 granted mothers nearly absolute authority over their children's welfare. Prosecuting a parent required overwhelming evidence of harm, and even then, juries often sided with family privacy over state intervention. The physical evidence was disturbing but circumstantial. The children's testimony was compelling but would be challenged as the delusions of isolated, uneducated youth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Circuit preacher Barnett, learning of the investigation, came forward with his 1854 observations. Sarah Hutchkins contributed her diary entries documenting Weaver's increasingly strange supply requests. Most significantly, county record keepers discovered the pattern of missing children in census records, showing a clear trail of offspring who appeared in one decade and vanished by the next with no documentation of marriage, migration, or death. On June 22, Sheriff Garrett formally arrested Prudence Weaver on suspicion of multiple murders spanning decades. She was transported to the county jail, maintaining absolute silence except to repeat that blood called to blood and that traditions older than law would ultimately prevail over temporary justice. Prudence Weaver died in her cell on July 18, 1856, before trial proceedings could begin. The official cause of death was listed as typhoid fever, a diagnosis that satisfied immediate administrative requirements but raised questions among those who had interacted with her during her confinement. The county coroner's private notes, discovered decades later in a trunk of miscellaneous documents, suggested the fever's sudden onset and rapid progression were inconsistent with typical disease patterns observed in the region. The jailer who attended her final days reported that Weaver had refused all food and water from the moment of her imprisonment, accepting nothing except what could be forced upon her during her lucid periods. Whether she deliberately starved herself as a final act of control, whether she ingested something during her brief moments alone, or whether typhoid genuinely struck remains a matter of historical speculation. What is certain is that her death eliminated any possibility of prosecuting the full scope of crimes committed across multiple generations. Without her testimony, investigators could document only what physical evidence revealed and what the 3 surviving children could verify. The official record, preserved in the county courthouse and later transferred to state archives, lists 4 confirmed child deaths directly associated with the Weaver property. Investigators suspected the actual number was substantially higher, but frontier record-keeping limitations and the property's long history made comprehensive accounting impossible. The burial sites revealed skeletal remains showing various ages of death from infancy through early adolescence. Dr. Frost, who assisted with examinations, noted in his medical journal that several of the remains displayed bone abnormalities suggesting genetic issues consistent with close relation parentage. His observations, though diplomatically phrased in official reports, painted a disturbing picture of multiple generations affected by the systematic practice Weaver had attempted to force upon her own children. The three Weaver siblings presented authorities with a profound challenge. Caleb, though legally an adult at 18, possessed no practical skills beyond basic subsistence farming. His education consisted entirely of what Ma Weaver had chosen to teach him, which focused on obedience rather than independence. He could barely read, had never handled money, and had spoken to fewer than 10 people outside his immediate family in his entire life. The psychological impact of learning his true parentage and the purpose for which he had been raised left him withdrawn and often unable to meet others' eyes during conversation. June, at 16, showed signs of resilience that impressed those who interviewed her. She could read adequately, possessed domestic skills, and demonstrated an intelligence that had survived despite deliberate limitation. Yet she also exhibited behaviors that revealed her trauma. She flinched at sudden movements, struggled with authority figures, and experienced episodes where she became fixated on checking locks and ensuring doors remained open. The prospect of placing her in a conventional household raised concerns about her ability to adapt to normal family dynamics. Lily, 14 and the most visibly damaged of the three, had regressed significantly since the night in the cellar. She spoke rarely and only in whispers, required constant reassurance about her physical safety, and showed signs of what physicians of the era could only describe as nervous collapse. The physical recovery from malnutrition would take months. The psychological recovery everyone recognized might never fully occur. After extensive consultation between Sheriff Garrett, Dr. Frost, and the county judge, the decision was made to separate the siblings completely. This choice, controversial even at the time, was based on the belief that remaining together would prevent them from establishing new identities free from their shared trauma. Each would be placed with a different family in communities far enough apart that accidental encounter would be unlikely, and each would be given a new surname to obscure their origins. Caleb was sent to a farming family named Bennett near Springfield, introduced as a distant relative who needed work and guidance. County records show he functioned adequately as a hired hand, following instructions and completing assigned tasks with mechanical precision. His employer's diary, preserved by descendants, describes a young man who seemed perpetually elsewhere in his thoughts, who never laughed or showed anger, who simply existed day to day without apparent hopes or ambitions. Around 1863, Caleb vanished from all documentation. Some accounts suggest he enlisted in military service during the Civil War under an assumed name and died in battle. Others claim he simply walked away one morning and disappeared into the Western Territories, where questions about background were rarely asked and men could reinvent themselves completely. June was placed with a merchant family in a town 60 miles southeast who had recently lost a daughter to scarlet fever and were willing to accept an older adopted child. She was recorded in the 1860 census as June Ashford, and official documents suggest she adapted more successfully than her siblings. She learned the merchant trade, handled customer interactions, and gradually built a reputation as a capable and trustworthy young woman. In 1862, she married Thomas Ridley, a carpenter, and over the following years gave birth to 3 children who survived to adulthood. Yet her descendants, interviewed by historians in the 1930s when the full Weaver story finally emerged, remembered her as a woman haunted by unspoken fears. She checked on her children compulsively, sometimes waking them multiple times during the night to confirm they were safe. She refused to allow them unsupervised time with extended family members and became physically ill when her husband suggested they might visit his relatives in the Ozarks. She kept every door in her home unlocked at all times and could not tolerate being in enclosed spaces without visible exits. When she died in 1897, her children found hidden throughout her home dozens of letters she had written but never sent, all addressed to her siblings, asking if they remembered what had happened and whether they too struggled to feel fully human. Lily endured the shortest and most difficult life of the 3. Placed with a teacher's family near the Arkansas border, she struggled profoundly with what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. The family who cared for her, documented in letters to county officials, described a girl who seemed trapped between childhood and some dark knowledge that prevented her from ever feeling safe. She had nightmares that left her screaming about cellars and candles. She sometimes became nonverbal for days at a time, staring at walls and refusing food. She never attended school, never formed friendships, and never recovered the ability to trust that the world contained more kindness than cruelty. She died in 1869 at age 27 of pneumonia, having never married, never spoken publicly about her early life, and never, according to those who knew her, smiled after the age of 14. The Weaver property itself became a source of local unease. Abandoned immediately following Ma Weaver's death, it stood empty through the late 1850s, gradually deteriorating as weather and wildlife reclaimed the clearing. In 1861, during the chaos and violence that accompanied the Civil War spread into Missouri, the cabin burned to the ground. Whether the fire was accidental, deliberately set by locals who wanted to erase the site's dark history, or started by one of the surviving siblings seeking to destroy the physical manifestation of their trauma was never determined. The land eventually reverted to wilderness. and by 1880 the exact location of the homestead was known only to a handful of older residents who preferred not to discuss it and discouraged others from asking questions. The full story remained largely suppressed for decades. Frontier communities had little tolerance for scandals that reflected poorly on cherished myths about settlement virtue and family values. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about maternal nature and the sanctity of parental authority, suggesting that isolation could enable horrors that contradicted everything civilized society wanted to believe about itself. Dr. Frost's journal, along with Sheriff Garrett's investigation notes, was filed away in county archives where bureaucratic neglect proved more effective than any deliberate cover-up. The documents gathered dust until 1923, when a historian researching frontier justice patterns discovered them and recognized their significance. The subsequent investigation, combining archival research with interviews of descendants and local historians, revealed that the Weaver case was not entirely unique. Similar patterns of isolated families maintaining abusive practices across generations appeared in multiple remote regions during the 19th century, protected by geographic isolation, limited communication networks, and cultural reluctance to interfere with parental authority. The Weaver case distinguished itself primarily through the survival of detailed documentation and credible witnesses, allowing historians to reconstruct events with unusual precision. The exact number of victims will never be known. Archaeological surveys of the former Weaver property conducted in 1957 by researchers from the University of Missouri identified at least 7 burial sites containing remains of children ranging from infancy to early adolescence. Forensic analysis suggested deaths spanning several decades, though precise dating proved impossible given the burial conditions and the passage of time. How many generations the practice continued before Caleb's refusal finally broke the cycle remains uncertain, though evidence suggests the tradition extended back at least to the 1830s when Constance Weaver first claimed the isolated property, and possibly to whatever circumstances drove her to seek such extreme isolation in the first place. The Weaver case stands as a haunting reminder of how darkness can flourish when hidden from scrutiny, how traditions can mask systematic cruelty generation after generation, and how victims of profound abuse, even when finally freed, carry scars that echo through their remaining years, and sometimes into the lives of their descendants. If this story disturbed you as much as it should, hit that like button and subscribe, because history holds thousands of buried horrors that deserve to be remembered. Not for sensationalism or entertainment, but so we recognize the warning signs and never allow such darkness to take root again.